preachy in Christianity and politics. We'll see. So yes, last week we were working through the different Reformation approaches to Christianity and politics, Christian political theology. We started with the separationist, the Baptist and Anabaptist stream in political theology. Looked last week at the Lutheran strand, sometimes referred to as realism or the paradoxical view. And then this week we'll look at the other side of the magisterial Reformation, the Calvinist stream in political theology. But as I've said before, I don't like to sort of label a whole system of political theology with reference to just one guy. So if you had to pick an ism, this is often referred to, the Reformed tradition in political theology, referred to as the people will refer to themselves as transformationists or transformationalism. And there are probably, many better graphical depictions of Calvinist political theology, but I just couldn't help myself, so the one for today is the beheading of King Charles I by the Puritan revolutionaries in England in the middle of the 17th century. Gives you some flavor of how different the reformed approaches to political theology could be, right? You had the separationist Baptists really just wanted to be left alone, had very little to say about the state and what secular government should be doing. You had a kind of restrained, passive strand in Lutheranism. The state is there to restrain evil. Christians can participate in it, but it's kind of a dismal view of the work of what the state is there to do, and Lutherans were very insistent on submission to state authority as the sort of only proper response of Christians to the government and to politics. Calvinists thought a bit differently about these questions, even departing from the same texts as the Lutherans, even to the point where, it's not just that Christians can be involved in government, but Christians can overthrow government when needed under this stream of political theology. So transformationism or transformationalism emphasizes, if we had to put it in a nutshell, emphasizes the creation mandate, a really significant focus on God telling Adam and Eve to be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it. So the emphasis on the creation mandate to subdue all the earth under the peaceful reign of Christ through the common grace God has bestowed on all his image bearers, ideas that we'll be going through in this hour. So as I mentioned, this is the Calvinist stream of political theology, so a major proponent was Calvin's Geneva, other centers of the Swiss and Dutch Reformation, differently from the German and the Lutheran Reformation at the same time, and then both of these were kind of swirled together in the English Reformation. And so you have a very strong strands of this vision coming out in English and then American Puritanism. In more modern times, contemporary life, this is still a very strong and vibrant tradition in the thinking of Abraham Kuyper, Francis Schaeffer, and their disciples, still a view that is very vibrant and taught in Reformed seminaries and colleges. So we turn to the theological structure of this view, right? What are the texts of Scripture that are emphasized? Where do you get the idea that Christians not only have a role to play in the state, but a very transformative role to be playing in society? As I mentioned already, the creation mandate that God gives to Adam and Eve to fill the earth and subdue it, and then is largely reaffirmed in the Noahic covenant, right? So the passage in Genesis when God is reaffirming his covenant with Noah doesn't use precisely the same language as subduing the earth and exercising dominion, but does echo back the creation mandate of multiplying, filling the earth, extending some kind of ownership and dominion over God's creation, from which the Reformed tradition really emphasizes, that this was not just an idea that was given to Adam and Eve before the fall. There is some kind of expectation that God has placed on his image bearers, even post-fall, even post-flood, even despite all of the fallenness and depravity. God has given a mission to all of his image bearers and expects them to fulfill it, expects them to be accountable for fulfilling it. And so this view is, we might say, highly affirmative of really all of human culture, but especially of government as well. So very, very Augustinian in the sense that it recognizes all of creation as the good gift of God, recognizes human government as not just this sort of negative thing, the consequence of sin, or some kind of thing you need because of sin, but as a good gift of God in itself, something that is to be loved and nurtured, worked on, perfected, not in a disordered way, right? And lots of disorder can creep into this sort of love, but something that has, a very affirmative vision for all of creation, and especially of human culture and government. And then another key text we can look at is 1 Peter 2, which sounds very similar to the text we looked at last time for Lutheran political theology. Romans 13 says, 1 Peter 2 says something very similar: be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme or to governors. So you get kind of multiple offices mentioned in 1 Peter in a way you did not in Romans. That will be somewhat influential in Reformed thought. As sent by him, by God, to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. As I say, this passage is very similar to the Romans 13 passage, and both Lutherans and Calvinists, both sides of the Reformation were looking at these passages to understand what their role in political life should be. But although they're very similar, there are slightly different emphases, right? Romans 13:2 also spoke about rewarding the good, but the emphasis in that passage was kind of on, bearing not the sword in vain, restraining sin, condemning evil. This is the role of political authority and the reason for Christians to submit to it. And that really became, as we saw last week, right, the emphasis in the Lutheran stream of political theology is government is really there to restrain sin. 1 Peter 2 also has this view of punishing evil, restraining sin, but then repeatedly emphasizes the good that government is meant to encourage, the good that people are supposed to do, and that government should reward. And that then is also the emphasis that we see in the Calvinist side, the more Reformed tradition of political theology, is that it's not just, right, not just about the restraint of sin, the punishing of evil, but there is also some kind of positive good for human governance to be accomplishing. And Christians are supposed to be participating in this common good in transformational ways, right? So this is where you get then the label of transformation, transformationalism, that it's not just that we sort of tolerate, abide by the government in this secular age, it's sort of a necessary evil, but government as a positive good has a role to actually change how people are behaving in society in positive and good ways, in ways that God wants his image bearers to be behaving. This is more or less a sunny contrast to the Lutheran view, right? So if the Lutheran view was sort of dismal and focused on the pervasiveness of sin and the need for government to restrain it, then Calvinism is the more affirmative, sunny side of that there's something for government to do. And if you're not deeply read in Reformed thought or history, that may sound like a very funny idea, right? Like, sunniness is not usually a word we associate with Calvinism, right? Isn't this the doctrine of total depravity and man's total inability to do anything about his sin, God's, total sovereignty, the Puritans, right? I'm wearing my very serious drab gray coat in honor of the Puritans. Like, these were not sunny people. These are the people preaching sinners in the hands of an angry God and inducing panic attacks up and down the eastern seaboard in the Great Awakening, right? So where do you get the sunniness and the affirmation? Might be a question. Again, if you're just sort of reading on the surface, like the Calvinist doctrines of grace. The answer to that question will bring us back to the two kingdoms view that we were talking about with Lutheranism, but in a different way. Before we get there, though, first let's finish on the first side of the handout, one of the key texts in laying out Reformed political theology, building off of the creation mandate in Genesis, the emphasis in 1 Peter and Romans, on the good and the rewarding of the good that the government can do. What then are the corollaries that the Reform take into, how Christians should relate to the state, whether Christians should participate in the state, a question we've been tracking in the other views as well. For this text, we'll turn not to one of the creeds or confessions written during the Magisterial Reformation, but one that comes a century later, the Westminster Confession, worked out by largely Presbyterian and Puritan Calvinists in England in 1647, which is a very important date for our discussion, right? So the Westminster Confession is not just a Reformation confession that's going to include some articles on governance and political theology. The Westminster Confession was written during the English Civil War, which was being prosecuted by Puritans against the English crown, right? So the Westminster Confession, right, is not just, some pastors deciding to sit around a table and write out what they believe. It is a thoroughly political document. It's meant to organize the opposition to the English crown. It's meant to get the Calvinists in England kind of on the same page as they are in the middle of prosecuting a war, overthrowing a king whom they will shortly behead as a tyrant to his own people, as a betrayer of his own oath to God. And so, again, this is not just like a theoretical exercise. This is the Calvinists working through how exactly can we justify what we are doing and how we are thinking about the world that we are currently participating in. So as you read the first lines of the article on Christian magistrates, where it declares that God is the supreme Lord and King of all the world, this is not just a throwaway line, right? This is not just, you got to clear your throat and begin somewhere. This is, again, thinking about the king they are presently overthrowing. How can they do that? Because they are ultimately recognizing God's kingship over all, and everything else has to flow from there. Even though God has told them to submit to their authorities, they are ultimately submitting to God as king in what they are doing right now and in the belief system that they are working out. So how does this work? God, the supreme king, has ordained civil magistrates to be under him, over the people, for his own glory and the public goods, right? There is something for magistrates to do, and it goes beyond just restraining sin and evil. The magistrate has duties of glorifying God, serving the public good. And so to this end, the magistrates are armed with the power of the sword for the defense and the encouragement of them that are good, right? We see the repeated emphasis from the scriptural passages that it is not just about punishing sin, but also encouraging good and doing good in the world. And this comes first in the Westminster Confession, right? The encouragement of them that are good, and then for the punishment of evildoers. So note the emphasis just in the order of these ideas. Okay, so consequently then, in Reformed thinking, it is lawful for Christians to accept and execute the office of a magistrate when called thereunto, in the managing whereof, as they ought especially to maintain piety, justice, and peace, according to the wholesome laws of each commonwealth. So for that end they may lawfully, now under the New Testament, wage war upon just and necessary occasions. So we're going to see this side of the Reformed tradition will agree with the Lutheran side of the Reformed tradition, right? That it is appropriate for Christians to serve in office, that it's appropriate for Christians to serve in the military, but this is going sort of beyond that, right? It's not just this is a tolerable behavior given the wickedness of sin and the need to restrain it. This is a behavior to be encouraged, right? This is actually fulfilling a task that God has given to his image bearers, that God has given to all government. And so Christians are, again, not just sort of tolerating government service or military service. They may be affirmatively called to do it. This is their calling by God. And again, it is not just in the sense of service, but even in leadership. It's not just that Christians can submit to being in the military, fighting the wars that the king has declared, but that Christians may be declaring those wars themselves, may be prosecuting them. And so even though the logic of revolution is not spelled out precisely in this article, you can kind of see where it comes from, right? If the magistrates God has ordained have certain duties to glorify God, to serve the common good, to maintain piety, justice, and peace according to the wholesome laws of each commonwealth, then the implied question that arises is what happens when those magistrates don't do that? Well, then it falls to the other magistrates to answer God's call, to overthrow the magistrates who have denied their oaths, who are failing in their duties before God. And so this is not, right, a wide-scale right of revolution. No, just mob of people can gather together and riot in Reformed political theology. But it is sort of a right of duly ordained magistrates to rise up against other magistrates who are not, fulfilling the purposes of their ordination, who are not glorifying God and maintaining peace according to justice and law. Finally then, how does the state relate to the church? The Westminster Confession is going to give a view that caused some trouble for the Reformed, both in the 16th century and then in subsequent centuries, and has been significantly modified in recent years in ways that we'll see. But the view that Westminster expresses, which is consistent with the Calvinist view and the creeds of the earlier Reformation, is that the civil magistrate may not assume to himself the administration of the words and sacraments. So there is this kind of separation of church and state, right? The state is not the church. It doesn't do the churchly ordinances, or the power of the keys of the kingdom of heaven. That is, it's really not for the state to decide what heresy and orthodoxy is. So the state should have no role in sort of defining doctrine and practice that the church has been assigned. Yet he, the civil magistrate, has authority, and it is his duty to take order that unity and peace be preserved in the church, that the truth of God be kept pure and entire, that all blasphemies and heresies be suppressed, all corruptions and abuses in worship and discipline prevented or reformed, and the ordinances of God duly settled, administered, and observed. So just basically as a matter of logic, right? If the secular government is called to preserve peace for the sake of the common good, and if heresy, blasphemy, false teaching about God disturbs the peace diminishes the good in civil society, then Westminster is just sort of working through the logic here. Then it can fall to the state to suppress these things and to suppress them with the sword if need be. So again, it's not that the state decides what is heresy and what is orthodoxy, but it more or less has to take direction then from the church. The church will inform the state what is heresy, and then leave it to the state to prosecute using its means. There is, especially when you're thinking about this in the context of the English Civil War and the Westminster Confession, there's almost like a comical bootstrapping quality to this, right? Like, why does heresy create disorder? Because the Orthodox, right? Because the Puritans are going to riot about heresy. Heresy disturbs the peace. If it is the duty of the state to maintain the peace, then it is the duty of this state to suppress heresy as those in control of the church at the time, those trying to assert right doctrine as they define it. This then can verge on integralism, which we looked at several weeks ago, the idea of Christendom. You take this all the way that the church is to inform the state on what proper doctrine is. The state is to use its power to suppress a wrong doctrine and its expression. Then you've basically ended up at Christendom all over again, just maybe a Protestant or a Puritan version of Christendom instead of a Catholic or Counter-Reformation version of Christendom, which is something that you do see in Calvinist practice. So the Puritans have their day in England, but then the political tide swings against them. They fall out of power both before and then after the English Civil War. When the Anglicans are sort of fully in control. Now, again, they're Reformed Christians, but they differ on, what are significant matters of doctrine, but still, from a certain distance, it looks like a pretty intramural squabble between Protestant Christians. And yet, when the Anglicans are in power, they defrock the Calvinist Puritans. They bar them from preaching, they imprison them, they exile them, they outlaw them. This is how so many Puritans end up immigrating to Massachusetts Bay Colony, end up in America, where once they establish political control, the Baptists, who again are a very intramural dispute, like Reformed Protestant Christians differ on what are, yes, significant doctrines, but all within the body of Reformed Protestant Christianity. And what do the Puritans do? They defrock them, they ban them from preaching, they imprison them, they whip them, they exile them, they drive them out. So it is the same kind of authoritarian establishment state that the Puritans were objecting to in England, they impose in Massachusetts Bay Colony. And this leads to numerous notorious episodes of this kind of authoritarian establishment of Christian teaching. In different times, in different places, probably one of the most notorious is Calvin's Geneva condemning to death and then burning at the stake Michael Servetus, who is sometimes mischaracterized as like a Baptist martyr. It is true that he denied infant baptism. He also denied the Trinity and the Nicene Creed, and so it is quite clear that Michael Servetus was unorthodox in about all of the ways that counted. Pretty much any state in Europe that got its hands on Servetus was probably going to put him to death. It was just a question of whether the Catholics would do it, or the Lutherans would do it, or Calvin's Geneva would do it, but it ended up being Calvin's Geneva that sentenced him to death by burning at the stake, which Calvin would have mitigated the punishment to behead him, but he would not have changed the sentence of death. Like that is how far the Reformed would take this view that real rank heresy and blasphemy is not just an affront against God, a sin against the church. It is at the root of civil disorder, and so it falls to the civil authorities to police it, even to the sentence of death and the infliction of capital punishment. Which then just kind of brings us back around to the question I asked before looking at the confession. These are ideas drawn out of the exact same text from the New Testament, from Romans, from 1 Peter, that the Baptists were looking at and concluding this is why we need to totally withdraw from the state, and the state should have nothing at all to do with defining or policing doctrine. The exact same texts that inspire Lutheran skepticism, a dismal view of the state, is the same texts that are giving us a really, Calvinist activism that will go so far to behead kings and burn heretics. So how do you get there? What other scriptural ideas? How is this theology working? The second point, and then turning to the back page, is we're back at Augustine, right? It's all footnotes on Augustine in the end again. So back to the two cities idea. There's the city of God and the earthly city. The Reformed tradition is going to maintain the very Protestant view, right, of there are two kingdoms, the earthly kingdom, the secular world, the political order, we could call it, and the heavenly kingdom, the church, the city of God, as Augustine called it. Like the Lutherans, the Calvinists like to use the term kingdom to emphasize, contra the Baptists, that God is presently ruling over both of these at the same time, right? This is not the earthly city as worldliness, the thing you need to just withdraw from in the Baptist view. This is the earthly city as a kingdom over which God rules in the present. It's just God's rulership is mediated differently in each kingdom. So God works through human government to rule over the secular order, and God works through church government to rule over the heavenly city, the kingdom of heaven. Let's turn to the slide where I'm trying to depict the difference between, hey, look, the columns line up. But here is the difference, right? Last week, we looked at the Lutheran division of labor in this two kingdoms idea, where Luther's idea was the sort of foundational distinction between law and gospel. The law of works and the gospel of grace is also the distinction between the two kingdoms, right? So God rules over the secular order through the law, right? His revelation shows people what God expects, what his character is like, so that the secular order understands what sin is and can restrain it. And that's how God rules over the secular kingdom in Lutheran theology, and then grace and gospel are for the church. Regeneration, being saved by grace and not by the works of the law. The law has different uses on the heavenly kingdom side. The Calvinists divided up very differently. Instead of thinking of the division between the two kingdoms as law and grace, law for the world, grace for the church, it's all grace. Right? The Calvinist doctrines of grace are not just grace for the church, but that God has given his grace to everyone. It's just different kinds of grace. So there is the special grace of redemption and regeneration is found only within the church. So there is going to be this special quality to the city of God. They have God's rulership mediated in a different way, and then, see all of Calvinist soteriology for how that works out. But the point not to be missed is that in the political realm, in the secular world, that too is ruled by, mediated by God's grace, or what the Reformed called God's common grace. So not the special grace of regeneration, sanctification, salvation in the church. But nevertheless, as James says, every good and perfect gift comes down from the Father of lights, right? That the Reformed read that to mean every good thing we have in creation, every good work that people do is right. If you really take God's sovereignty and his grace seriously, these are all gifts of God's grace. The Lutheran view, the Calvinists would say, sort of imply that you can work in your own strength to fulfill the law, at least in some degree. That it's sort of up to you to read the Bible and put it into work. And the Calvinist view is no, it's all God's grace in the end. Whether you're able to do anything good, any good gift of creation, any scientific, technological achievement, these are all gifts of God's grace, and a grace that God has poured out on all, right? This is a reaffirmation of people created in the image of God. It means that every person, even unregenerate, even if they are not in the church, even if they are not responding to the gospel, still has that image of God and the ability to create, innovate, understand God's creation, work in perfecting all of the human arts, and one of those arts includes government, right? And so then this is where you get actually the sunny side, the affirmative view, that even those who are most well known for emphasizing depravity and fallenness, the total sovereignty of God, at first, and this has troubled a number of historians, it seems like a paradox that the people who are most committed to what seems like a theology of determinism and total inability for men to accomplish anything are the ones who at various times are the most active in social life, are beheading kings and fomenting revolutions. The Calvinists, after all, were cutting off the heads of kings before anyone else thought it was a cool thing to do, right? Like centuries before the French liberals think this is like a neat idea. It's the Reformed, the Calvinists, who are so active in the world. How does this work? I mean, Charles Taylor sums it up pretty well on, you have this quotation on the handout. To the Calvinist, it seems self-evident that the properly regenerate person would above all be appalled at the offense done to God in a sinful, disordered world, right? So you can emphasize depravity and fallenness without arriving at passivity or quietism. Instead, that therefore one of the foremost aims, right, of the redeemed Christian would be to put this right, to clean up the human mess, or at least to mitigate the tremendous continuing insult done to God. Not because you believe that works will save you, but precisely because you believe they won't, right? That because God has extended this grace, because God is so affronted by sin, you are liberated, really, by God's sovereignty, by his grace poured out on all, including especially the redeemed, to work for the honor of God, to extend, what is often referred to as the Protestant work ethic. Not just that we work hard in our commercial vocations to honor God, to restore his creation, but that you work hard in all your vocations, and if that vocation includes government work and politics, that you work hard in that to extend God's grace and redeeming influence in all of these areas. This can lead to a couple of significant corollaries and maybe consequences and maybe difficulties or challenges then that the Reformed approach encounters over time. So one corollary is, as I say in subpart A here, is that as image bearers of God, even the unregenerate may develop the craft of governing wisely and well, right? Since all people are made in God's image, they reflect his creativity, his curiosity and understanding how the created order works, how it can flourish, innovativeness, wisdom in ruling, authority, administration. Christians should be good at that too, but if you take both of these ideas seriously, what it can mean is that it very well may be that unredeemed people, secular people, may be very good at governing. A lot of redeemed people, a lot of Christians, may be very bad at governing, right? Because we are still fallen, we still struggle with sin. Sanctification does not happen totally in this life. And so the corollary of this way of thinking, right, is that you should not be totally surprised that people outside the church may be able to govern wisely and well. You should not be surprised that people inside the church may not govern especially wisely and well. And in fact, it may turn out that secular people do a lot better job in different times and places at governing wisely and well than people in the church. Or as I put it here, don't take it for granted that just because the church has God's special grace, it can somehow govern better, more effectively, or that it can do it more easily. And this was a point that is really strongly emphasized in Reformation theology. I think has been significantly overlooked or forgotten in recent years. This is one of the problems I think I'll point out with views calling themselves Christian nationalism today, is it just so many times today people just sort of take for granted that Christians have the right answers on politics and governance because they're Christians, because they can read the Bible and they have the truth and they can apply it. This was not the view of the magisterial reformers, as they're called. This was not Calvin's view, certainly. I give an example here that I recently learned about from my friend and colleague John Whitty. I gave you a recommended reading from John Whitty on the handout last week. I'll just say again, he is the foremost scholar, really, of the history of Reformed thought on law and politics, and is also just the warmest Christian scholar I have ever encountered. So I can't commend or recommend the work of John Whitty highly enough. The example I'm pulling here is coming from forthcoming work, so watch for a book coming out this year on Calvin's Geneva and the way Calvin thought about law in all its dimensions. But Professor Whitty was telling me about a case that came before Calvin, and this is common in all of the cases that Professor Whitty was reading about. It was this particular case was an abused wife asking the church if she could leave her husband, if the church would protect her in that choice. Now, this is a hard situation. Whether it's a hard question might depend on the scriptures that immediately come to mind and how you might apply them. Certainly there are scriptures you could apply to this case. Calvin and the consistory ultimately answered the question, yes, she could leave, the church would protect her. But the way they got there, right, was not just sort of sitting around a table for a few minutes asking themselves what would be the right thing to do. It was also not just looking at a few scriptures and then taking a vote and just sort of straightforwardly applying what they thought they saw in scripture. No, for this case and for basically every case that was coming before them as a matter of church discipline or as a matter of government, they would assemble all the scriptures they thought relevant with commentaries in multiple languages. They would then immediately turn to Augustine, always Augustine, right? He said, what does Augustine say? What, if anything, has he said on this topic? What have the other church fathers said down through the ages on cases of this kind? What does Catholic canon law instruct? Yes, we are the Protestant Reformation. We are leaving the Catholic Church, but still, the Catholic canon law was worked out by well-meaning people over centuries trying to apply the scriptures to practical living. So we ought to at least check what they would have done with this case. What does their law say? Also, again, image of God in all creatures, let's see what European common law would do with this. If we weren't in Geneva, how would this be handled in other places? Both as a matter of common law, what would all of Europe think about this, and as a matter of local law. Let's write to our brothers in the other cantons. Let's write to Martin Luther, see what he would do with this. And then at the end of that, we deliberate, we assemble all of these things in multiple languages, right? We assemble this as the case file to make this single adjudication, then we move on to the next case, and the process starts all over again. What does Augustine say? The Church Fathers, the canon law. How do we work this out deliberately? The point is that it was hard work. It was not taken for granted that just because you were a Christian, just because you had access to God's special grace, that applying Christianity to politics was going to be a straightforward or easy thing. If anything, the warning here is because God has given his grace to all, because there are so many sources of law and wisdom and authority for adjudication. If you're going to do this well, you need to consult them all, be very careful, be very humble in this enterprise, which in preparing for this reminded me of the opening line from Mark Knoll's The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind, that the scandal of the evangelical mind is that there is not much of an evangelical mind, which Knoll, an evangelical, was trying to make the point, not that Christians have things to say and secular society is not listening to us. The outside world is not paying attention to us. That was not his lament. His lament was, Christians are not working hard enough to have something to say to secular society in the world and in the academy as he observed it in the early 90s. That right, if you really take Reformed theology seriously on these points, again, you can't just take it for granted that all you need to do is sort of read the scripture and now you have all of the right answers. But no, if Christians really want to govern well in politics, but also in the arts and the sciences and the university, then they've got to work hard at excellence in the arts and the sciences and the university and in politics. And Knoll's work was really written to say, I just don't see you putting the work in these days. This is not something that just comes reflexively. This is not just like a special talent that God bestows on his elect. So all improvements of the human condition, all wise leadership comes by God's grace, but the sort of warning here is the unredeemed may apply this grace more expertly, and the redeemed may waste their talents if they're not careful. This is where, again, the challenges can arise, not so much showing that the Reformed approach is wrong or that this necessarily has to happen as a consequence. But if you take these ideas seriously, what it means is, you may not necessarily need the church at all to govern well. If God has poured out his common grace on all, and if it's a matter of just putting in the effort to understand God's creation, to understand his natural law, and to apply it in the administration of secular life, what then do you really need the church for, is what some have asked. And we see this sort of perennial problem in the Reformed tradition, that just practically, it's hard to pass on the Reformed outlook from generation to generation, right? The first generation of Puritan immigrants to the United States, what becomes the United States, all become ministers. The second generation all become lawyers, right? It's an exaggeration, but only slight. And it's not to say that the lawyers were all, reprobate, but you see the shift in emphasis, right? That if what we're here to do is really study God's creation under God's common grace, to perfect our arts in it, then just you can easily lose sight of, this would be the Baptist critique of this view. You can easily lose sight of what was so central to the Baptists and the separationists, the need for the church to be the place that incubates moral development and virtue and uses church discipline for these things. The more you emphasize common grace, the easier it is for the second generation to just kind of slip off into that emphasis and not remain in the church. Was the story of American Puritanism, and then is also one way of maybe telling the story of what happens at the end of the 19th century with the rise of the social gospel, a topic that we'll be looking at next week. Which again is not to say that this is necessarily a consequence of the Reformed political theology. All of these streams that we're looking at, they struggle with balance, right? And there are ditches on either side of the road. And all of the streams we're looking at could be used to critique one another. But so it's just to emphasize the point that the two ditches on either side of the road for the Reformed approach is on the one side, just sort of giving over the creation mandate to secular society and leaving yourself with a pretty anemic church. Why do church discipline? Why think that the church has any particular role in cultivating virtue or virtuous practice? On the other side of the ditch is where we started with the state policing heresy. You might give, instead of giving everything over to common grace and secular society, you might give everything over to the church in a way that is dictating to the state what exactly the orthodoxy is that it should be enforcing. So Knoll is responsive to the first problem, and then point 3 here, Kuyper and the sort of turn in the tradition in modern times is responsive to the second, the problem. How do you keep Reformed theology from just becoming another integralism, another Christendom that is just as narrow and oppressive as medieval Catholic Christendom? Kuyper, a 20th century Dutch Calvinist, his answer was to sort of break down the different roles that people use in fulfilling the creation mandate, so that it is not just the two kingdoms. There is secular power and there is church power, but really there are multiple spheres of creation, multiple ways in which people are bringing the created order under God's dominion, which include the family, types of associational life that are not just governments, churches, in addition to others. Schools themselves may be one of these. Now, you can dispute just what all these different spheres are and how self-contained they would be, but Kuyper's point was that ultimately each of these spheres, what sort of marks them and sets them apart from one another, is they are each directly accountable to God, meaning they are not mediated through the authority of the other spheres. That really there is something for families to do as families, not just as a subunit of the church, and not just as a subunit of the state, but that there is a realm in which the family itself is just directly accountable to God, and so the other spheres should not be taking that over or trying to interfere or trying to mediate these relationships. Same with the church. There are things for churches to do where they are directly accountable just to God, not to the state, not to the family, not to the school. Same with schools, same with corporation. Now again, should every corporation really think of itself as just directly accountable to God? You may want to quibble with, you may want to define just what parts of corporate associational life are directly accountable to God. That's all sort of with the interfamily debate within the Kuyper approach. But this then became a way of providing for, as Kuyper sloganized it, a free church in a free state. You don't want to see one sphere doing all of the work of the other ones. You don't want to see the church totally substitute for the family. There should be some kind of family life outside even the church, which is not to say It's not directed by the gospel. It's not in conformity with what the gospel teaches about family life, but it's just the relationship of the institutions is different, and there are parts of these institutions that report directly to God and not to the other institutions, is one way of responding to this problem of how do you keep a state from gaining more or less a total monopoly over doctrine, over all of virtuous practice. How do you leave some room for disagreement? How do you leave room for dissenting churches was one way of proposing a solution. Another is just to re-emphasize fallenness, depravity, the limitations of sin, that even if you don't separate the world into these different spheres, you should be cautious. Yes, God has given his common grace to his image bearers. They can govern well, but they are also depraved people. We should worry about monopolization of power, temptations of corruption. Again, the hard work that it takes to discern proper teaching from heresy, we should worry that if even the elect are going to make mistakes here, how much more are people unredeemed, just subject to God's common grace, liable to make mistakes in their fallen state? And to especially emphasize that while you should work hard at fulfilling God's mandate, you kind of have to manage your expectations. You shouldn't expect that the coming kingdom is going to come through that hard work. You should expect disappointment. You should expect setbacks. You should expect to see corruptions. And so governing well is going to mean governing in light of those realities, having a kind of chastened Christendom, if it's a Christendom at all. The question that arises is where we're going next week then. Is if in the 20th century, Calvinists suddenly learned to manage their expectations, to sort of step down their revolutionary zeal, to not have the state bring about the kingdom. Some critics of this move will say, isn't that peculiar timing? That the Calvinists who were once beheading kings all of a sudden learned how to stop being revolutionaries in the mid-20th century, just at the time that African American Calvinists were trying to foment revolution, were seeking to achieve civil rights. Isn't it sort of weird that the Calvinists became less activist right at the time other branches of Christianity were becoming more activist, is the question we'll take up next week. Isn't that kind of peculiar? What was going on? And we'll see that there's more or less like a split in the streams here. It's not that all of Calvinism turns in a Kuyperian direction. Some sides keep their revolutionary zeal, and we'll see that side next week. Let's close in prayer. Lord, again, we thank you for the witness of your church through the ages. Thank you for the ways that Christians have wrestled with the rich teaching of your scripture about our creation in your image, about our fallenness, about our hope in redemption, and the serious thinking that your church has done through the ages in trying to work out how then we should live in this present world. We pray for your continued guidance and wisdom as we search your scriptures and think about the ways that your body has worked this out over time. In Christ's name, amen.